Welcome to this Sporting Heritage Ignored Heritage webinar. Lots of faces that I recognise and a few that I don't. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Fran Stovold and I'm the Workforce Development Lead for Sporting Heritage. So I oversee the webinar programme, the conference and the networks and the hangouts. We're very lucky today to have Kris with us, who's going to lead the main part of the session. So I'll hand over to him in a couple of minutes. As most of you will know, we are recording this session, so if you don't wish to be recorded, please feel free to turn your cameras off. Just letting the last couple of people in. And if we have any technical difficulties, please, if you drop out, please log on back on with the same details that you logged in, and I will keep an eye on the waiting room, or if anything goes down at our end, we will let you know how best to rejoin. So I think that's all the housekeeping for now. So Kris, I'm going to hand over to you to start the session.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you get something out of this. So just to begin with, I'm just going to share, sorry, I'm going to load up a PowerPoint, bear with me. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to the project, what we've sought to achieve, and also I'll give a bit of insight into some of the conclusions that we've reached and what we hope might happen going forward. So just to tell you about myself, my name is Kris McKie. I'm a freelance heritage professional, and I've been working with Sporting Heritage since January on the Ignored Sporting Heritage project with my colleague David, who's somewhere in here. To look at the degree to which sporting heritage collections currently represent ethnic diversity in sport, and explore how collecting practices have shaped this, and also to look at identifying opportunities to better collect, preserve and represent the sporting heritage of diverse ethnic communities. So the project interviewed representatives of heritage organisations, grassroots sports clubs, charities, community organisations, organisations that work to confront racism and promote inclusivity in sport, and academic specialists in race and sport in order to understand what can be done to build a more inclusive and representative picture of the heritage of sport in Britain. So I'm just going to skip slide. So the project will culminate in a report outlining the situation and opportunities that offer key recommendations for Sporting Heritage, the organisation, to support activity to better represent ethnic minority communities in sport. Just as an aside, I must state here that any exploration of race and representation in heritage collections must acknowledge the structural inequalities that exist in the heritage sector. A recent ARA survey suggests that over 98% of the archives profession in Britain identify as white. And as the Museums Association states, ultimately, museums cannot achieve their objectives unless they are founded on equality, diversity and inclusion, and want to embed this practice in their own organisational practice. So sporting heritage collections also, by their nature, reflect racism and exclusion within sport. So that's another challenge that we've been looking at in the project. And just to say that this is a huge subject, it's complex, and historic relationships between different communities and different sports means that no attempt can be made to develop a singular strategy around inclusivity and representation. And there are many more fundamental issues that need addressing, such as experience of ethnic minority women in sport and underrepresentation of sports such as that have origins outside of Britain, such as kabaddi and Punjabi wrestling. However, what this project is seeking to do is just make the case for action towards greater representation of diversity in sport, and hopefully offer some useful reflection on how this might be achieved. The webinar today, we're going to look at some of the issues we've been exploring, but we don't want to give the impression that this is a kind of conclusive event. So we've left room for a couple of group discussions around key challenges that we've identified, and we'll make sure that there's plenty of time at the end for discussion, comments and questions, hopefully. Right, so that's just an overview of the project and where we are. That's the aim of the webinar. So to begin with, the project sought to get a sense of existing ethnic diversity in sporting collections. We've engaged with a number of representatives of sporting collections. I know many of you are here today. And we've looked at what sporting heritage collections tend to include, how they've been developed, and the degree to which they represent diversity. So just to note, the research focused on established heritage organisations and doesn't necessarily take into account heritage held by clubs or other sporting bodies or private collectors. And it also must be noted that the sporting heritage sector is a complex sector, and sport has only really recently started to receive attention as a distinctive form of heritage. So this isn't a kind of straightforward issue for organisations as well. But I'm just going to give a few kind of general observations on the sector as a whole, not relating to the activities of any specific organisations. So while the scale of the research was limited, it clearly suggests that ethnic diversity is critically underrepresented across the sporting heritage sector. The material that we highlighted and identified and was kind of made aware of that represents the history of diverse participation in sport is largely fragmentary, it's quite ephemeral, and it offers very little insight of substance into the sporting heritage of Britain's diverse ethnic communities. And then we did note substantial increase in representation of diversity within public programming and educational outreach. But one thing we've noticed is that there's a lot of emphasis on, say, pioneering figures and the significance of role models and pioneers, but there's less of a focus on diversity of participation as a whole across sports. We also noted that there was a high level of ambition across all organisations to better understand and represent the lack of diversity. And some organisations are developing really clear strategies around this. But to begin with, I just wanted to look at why it is the case that, or why we think it's the case that sporting heritage collections tend to have an underrepresentation of ethnic diversity. Firstly, we concluded that the most commonly represented themes in sporting collections tend to be professional and elite sport, administration of sport and histories of sport governing bodies, and evolutions and developments in how sports are played. We identified considerably fewer collections that reflect wider social histories of sport, or, for example, the histories and experiences of communities such as supporters, recreational players, or grassroots and amateur clubs. And we think that the predominant focus across the sector on professional and elite sport means that sporting heritage tends to inherit inequalities that exist within sports. And it means that many aspects of diverse participation at other levels of sport and within wider communities is generally overlooked. And David's going to give a case study shortly looking at South Asian participation in football, which offers a really kind of interesting example. So it could really be suggested that a challenge for sporting heritage isn't simply how to better represent ethnic diversity in collections, it's equally how to move away from a predominantly centralised view of sport to one that looks to capture diversity of sport across different communities. And in order to begin to do this, new approaches to democratise and community-led collecting do need to be developed. However, the approach to ongoing collecting of sporting heritage tends to largely be reactive. That's what we've identified. relying on offers of material from forthcoming collectors or individuals or organisations. Obviously, this is with the exception of a number of specific collections that have looked to address gaps by proactive collecting. And the significant disadvantage of reactive collecting is that it tends to favour groups and individuals who have an existing connection or identification with heritage, who see themselves and those like them represented in the history of sport. It doesn't empower or encourage other people to contribute to heritage necessarily. And this isn't by any means specific to sporting heritage, it's endemic across the heritage sector, reactive collecting and the issues that this creates in inequality. In the latest sector-wide collecting strategy, the Museums Association state that collecting is under pressure from budget cuts, and many museums are only able to collect reactively. Museums should, however, look to collect strategically and in partnership with users and communities, recognizing that many areas of collecting can be carried out at relatively low cost and with substantial social impact. I think it's really interesting as well to note that there's a lack of sport in the wider heritage sector and how this compounds the lack of diverse representation in sport. So sport still struggles to be a topic for serious interest in the wider heritage sector. And in particular, heritage activity that's specifically focused on ethnic diversity and representation has tended to overlook sport as a topic of serious consideration. So it's interesting to know, for example, that recent high-profile community-led projects that seek to confront underrepresentation in museums and archives, such as, for example, Birmingham Museum Trust, their Collecting Birmingham project, or Liverpool Museum's Sankofa project, rarely feature inclusion of sport as an area of substantial focus. Nor does sport appear to be an area of serious consideration for organisations whose exclusive purpose is the collection and preservation of the heritage of underrepresented ethnic minority communities. So, for example, if we look at the collections of the Black Cultural Archives, George Padmore Institute, the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Relations Archive in Manchester, the Institute for Race Relations Black History Collection, see these are four of the kind of primary organisations with a specific focus on representing diverse ethnic communities. Very little material is held that relates to sport, essentially none across all of these organisations, apart from some kind of ephemeral material. And this is despite the fact that sport has long been a very high profile and active forum for conversations about race and racism in British society. It has the potential to offer unique insights into the history of colonialism, empire, migration, and also grassroots sports clubs and other sporting groups have often held very distinct and important places within communities. So what we hope to kind of try and convey is why we need to talk about representation in sporting heritage. So I'm sure many of us here will be generally aware of the need for greater representation in museums and archives. We're aware of the need for museums to be resilient and reflective. And we're also aware of the changing demographics of audiences and the fact that increasing numbers of people aren't able to see themselves represented. And also there's much greater understanding now than ever before of the inequalities that are inherent in collecting and exhibiting practices. And many museums are starting to put issues like decolonization on the agenda. But what we want to do in this project is to really kind of probe the question in relation to sport specifically, and look at how a lack of representation in sporting heritage limits what we can achieve and the stories that we can tell. So I'm going to pass over here. Are you ready, David? Sorry, I'm putting you on spot. I'm trying to find you. I'm going to pass over to my colleague David, who has a case study looking at football and in particular South Asian communities. I'm just going to, sorry, I'm just going to faff around with PowerPoints. I'm going to get your PowerPoint up if you bear with me 1 second.
Brilliant, thanks, Chris. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm David. So I've been sort of supporting Chris with much of the research as the project's gone along since January. It's really nice to see some of the people I've interviewed along the way here as well. Really glad so many of you could make it.
Sorry. Right.
Nice one. Thanks, Chris. Am I okay to nudge
Yeah,
you?
just
Let
tell
me
me
know
when.
when to change slides.
Yeah.
Thank you. Everyone's favorite job. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about football and the heritage sector. So obviously, I think most people would agree football is the most high-profile sport in the country. And this is reflected, I think, in the amount of heritage activity around it, including exhibitions and representation in collections. So not just collections in sport-specific museums, but kind of local museum services as well tends to have at least some football-related material. I think one of the reasons football is much more likely than other sports to form part of a museum collection is because it is so widely played all over the country. And thinking about the display side as well, football can offer places a chance for a really high profile exhibition, a big target audience that might reach beyond typical heritage audiences. I've been involved in an exhibition about Newcastle United earlier in my career and kind of seen for myself how crowd pleasing this sort of activity can be. Yeah, because of the high profile nature of the sport and the diversity within the game, at least on the playing side, football is an area where we can see greater diversity in collecting and exhibition activity. So I just flagged a couple of examples in the slide here. Recent collecting efforts around Black Lives Matter protests in football. And there have been numerous exhibitions over the years about pioneering Black players in British football. So in this sense, football can be seen as a subject which the heritage sector has used to tell more diverse stories. And this is all good work to be commended. I think part of our work has just been looking at areas where this work could continue and develop and maybe dig a bit deeper, looking beyond some of the mainstream narratives around particular sports. So I've got a quote on my next slide. As Chris was saying, one area we have focused on in depth is the involvement in football among British South Asians. This began to emerge quite early on as a subject with a rich heritage that's been largely overlooked in museum exhibitions and collections. Main reason we think for this limited involvement of the heritage sector is the lack of British South Asian players who've managed to break through into that elite level of the game. This quote here from Kick It Out is how they describe the lack of British South Asian players. 7.5% of the UK population are Asian, but there was just 8 South Asian players who made first team appearances in the Premier League and the EFL in the 2019-2020 season. So that's around 0.27% of the 3,000 players in those leagues. Interesting to note as well, that's a ratio, a percentage that's largely unchanged in the last 30 years. I've got a few more stats on the next slide that's starting to look at reasons for the lack of Asian involvement in the elite level game in Britain. A widely held view that comes up all of the time is that Asians in Britain aren't interested in football, either as fans or as players. Many of you will remember this was a stereotype that was promoted by the former FA chairman, Greg Clark, who, as part of the kind of infamous interview, which led to him losing his position, mentioned that the British Asians were more interested in pursuing careers in IT than in playing football. There's actually a lot of kind of research and studies out there which show this is a stereotype which is actually completely false. A study that I really liked was from 1991 from the University of Manchester, a study into participation in football among young boys in Britain. It showed that 43% of white British boys regularly played football. And in comparison, 60% of British Bangladeshi boys were recorded as playing football regularly, 43% of British Pakistani boys, and 36% of British Indian boys. The reason I like this study, even though it's now 30 years old, is that I think the timing is quite significant, because the generations that were being studied and recorded there are the kind of generation that could, should, would have broken through into the elite level of the game by now. The time when when people talk about England's so-called golden generation, this is kind of the time when those players would have been playing youth and junior level football. It sort of begs the question, what happened to all of the young British Asians playing football at that time? And why did so few break through to the top of the game? Looking at research that's kind of detailed quite widely in academic studies, also reports by the FA and the PFA, these have suggested a number of barriers into the elite level game for British Asians. I've listed a few here. It can include scouts, who are mostly white men, being unwilling to attend Asian club matches. Also includes some of those stereotypes that I've already mentioned, widely held stereotypes about the physique and the stamina of Asian players. Barriers can also include prejudices shown towards Asian clubs by local FA and league organisers. Again, these administrators are in most cases white men. And this kind of, as part of this project that Kris and I have done, was quite a important, I think, learning point for me, because I'd always kind of believed in the idea of football as like a great meritocracy, and kind of quite often hear pundits repeating that line that if you're good enough as a player, you can make it to the top of the game. That kind of overlooks some of these systemic issues that have been identified around British South Asian players. On the next slide, I've got a few club crests here. I think things get really interesting from a sports heritage perspective when you start to look at some of the British Asian clubs that were founded as far back as the 1960s. So major and historic clubs include Albion Sports from Bradford, Sporting Khalsa from the West Midlands, Leicester Nirvana, and Sporting Bengal United from East London. And broadening out kind of your area of focus into the grassroots game offers a really interesting way of exploring not just the history of football, but ways of linking that to bigger themes around migration, integration, racism. Many of these historic clubs were founded due to exclusion from other local clubs and the way they offered a kind of safe and supportive environment to participate in the sport without the fear of racist discrimination. What you see time and time again with these clubs is how deeply embedded they are in their communities, often linked to local businesses, local religious groups. Interesting kind of academic research. We looked at some research by an academic called Daniel Kilvington, who's mentioned a lot of research into these clubs and their players, but also the longer history of South Asians in football, including leagues in India in the 1800s. I guess in short, South Asians were playing football long before migration to England began in large numbers, and people arriving in the 1950s and 1960s already played the game, understood the game, and loved the game. In our research, we've seen that sporting exhibitions and collecting activity in museums so often focuses on big star names and historic achievements at the elite level of the game. Unfortunately, this is an approach which almost entirely overlooks the involvement of British Asians in football. As with a few notable exceptions, these players and coaches haven't been able to make it into the top level of the sport. On the next slide, I've got a couple of images from a really interesting project that we found. It was organised by a club called Guru Nanak Gurdwara FC in Leicester. The club successfully obtained HLF money to commemorate their 50-year anniversary and launched a collecting project with past players. They filmed interviews, recorded oral histories, and produced an exhibition that was briefly displayed last year before COVID hit. Speaking to people involved with the club and who worked on the project, revealed that one of their motivations for it was the fear of completely losing the chance to record the history of their club. Many of the people who were first generation players or involved at the founding of the club were starting to get older, and they really just wanted to capture those stories while they still could. They do have plans for further heritage activity driven by the club. They're thinking about starting up their own club museum, and really interesting, ambitious ideas to go beyond football specifically and really look at the club's place within the Sikh community in Leicester. They're kind of so central to life there that they feel they're the best organisation to capture and share some of those stories. I did see flashing up just in the chat a question about where women's football fits into this. GNGFC are a really good example, I think, of a club who have massively expanded their women's football teams, and kind of as part of this HLF history project that they ran, they were really keen to kind of speak to the first women players involved at the club, capture some of those stories and sort of show how that's going to be a big part of the club going forward. The project was a great example of a grassroots football club celebrating their own history, and also really challenging some of those stereotypes that I mentioned around British Asians and football. And yeah, not being afraid to take on some of those broader themes as well, around community exclusion and racism. Yeah, and I guess to sum up, this subject of British South Asian involvement in football, it's a really interesting one, a really exciting one. The more work we've done on it, I think the more enthused and passionate about it we've become, and it's definitely something that could be explored further within the heritage sector. it's got a long history. It's a new and interesting way to explore migration and community integration stories. It touches on all levels of the playing side of football. Also interesting ways to explore football fandom as well in South Asian communities. I think I've got a little banner on the next slide for Punjabi Wolves, who really interesting fan group who've been an active part of that support since the 1950s. We were thinking about sort of why these stories aren't widely known or haven't been widely told in the heritage sector. I think in some ways the British South Asian football story is a complex one. It doesn't necessarily neatly fit within the established story of mainstream British football, but it's been really notable to Kris and I how many of the people we've spoken to in the project have identified this area as something that's really rich to explore further, and even sort of people outside the heritage sector saying to us that kind of museums really have a powerful position to tell some of these stories and hopefully try and challenge some of those widely held stereotypes. I'm starting to lose my voice, so I think this is a good time to hand back to you, Kris.
Sorry, I'm just going to faff on with something PowerPoints again. Bear with me. Oh. Right. Sorry, thanks, David. So yeah, that was kind of one of the areas, the key areas that we've been delving into. Obviously, sport is such a huge and varied topic, and the connections that different communities have with sport is immense as a subject. So we've kind of focused on some kind of key areas over the project. But what I'd like to do now is just to kind of revisit some of the issues that David raised as to what sport can offer, and what the lack of kind of representation in sport and heritage collections, how that limits what we can achieve. So looking at sport as a vehicle to explore wider issues of migration, community cohesion, and racism. Sport offers unique avenues of exploration into histories of these subjects. It's a really cross-cultural phenomenon. People of diverse heritage play the same game, or if not the same game, then games with relatable social functions, cultures, traditions. And as such, sport is a really useful vehicle for exploring wider issues around issues of community and culture. And the colonial histories of many sports in Britain and the fact that they've been shaped by cultural exchange means that sporting heritage is in a really unique position to offer valuable insights into British colonialism and its legacies. I'm just going to highlight a specific project. I haven't had time to put a clip on for this, but there's a really fascinating project that we came across called Parks to Pavilions, which was run by the Asian Youth Alliance, a charity in London. And it was a project that recorded interviews and collected memorabilia from the founders of one of the oldest Asian-led cricket leagues in Britain, the Bradford-based Qaid-e-Azam Sunday Cricket League. And yeah, I've got a quote here from the project founder, Mabeen Butt, who he says that he believes the way black and mixed race players and audiences have changed the face of football, Asian players and supporters could go on to change the face of cricket. And when this happens, material that projects like that collect will be vital to help tell a wider story of cricket in Britain. But what's really interesting about the project, and I really urge anyone who's kind of interested in sporting heritage more generally, or specifically cricket, to have a look at it. It not only kind of explores those perspectives on cricket as a sport, but it also really uses the cricket as a vehicle to explore wider issues such as racism, community cohesion and identity among South Asian communities in like 60s and 70s Yorkshire. And many of the interviews that are carried out, and all of them are still available on the project website, which has a ton of other resources as well, and really recommend it. Many of the interviews reflect these wider experiences in social history. We've observed that there's also substantial potential for sporting heritage to contribute to conversations around race in sport today and to challenge stereotypes that exist today. I spoke to Kash Tank, who's the sports equality manager at Glasgow Life, and also is involved in SEMSA, the Sporting Ethnic Minorities Scottish Ethnic Minority Sporting Association, I think. And he made an really interesting point that sporting heritage has a real opportunity to hold institutions to account. So recently, institutional racism and inequality within sport has been yet again brought into the public eye. In 2020, last year, Chris Grant of Sport England said that inequalities in sport are so deeply rooted within sport structures and assumptions that the situation amounts to a kind of apartheid hiding in plain sight. And he called for the creation of a forum where people can talk frankly about historical and present day issues without criticism or prejudice. I think it's obvious what sporting heritage could contribute to those kind of conversations by offering a more accurate depiction of participation in sport across society, by promoting understanding of the historic connections that different communities have with sport, and by looking to challenge inaccurate and damaging stereotypes. There are a number of, well, there have long been a number of diversity initiatives delivered by sporting bodies. Recently, the FA have kind of relaunched the second phase of their Asian inclusion plan, for example, and also the ECB. They, a couple of years ago, launched their South Asian Action Plan, both looking at how to better represent Asian communities within their respective sports. And initiatives like these are welcome attempts to address lack of representation in the game. However, they don't pay a lot of attention to historic relationships within sport, and they present the issue as a kind of fundamentally present issue rather than a historic issue. And what the sporting heritage sector could be offering is a valuable historic perspective on these issues, helping to raise awareness of long-standing relationships. Another project to highlight, sorry, I should have put this on my slides, but if you're interested in football and particularly sports communities, a project that sought to dig beneath the surface of stereotypes and assumptions that are attached to sporting communities was a project called The Changing Face of Millwall, which was delivered by a Southwark-based community charity called Bede House. The project founder and lead, Dr. Ole Jensen at the Open University, he developed the idea for the project after reading of the death of a Millwall fan called Tiny. In the introduction to the project, he writes that to an outsider, being Black and being Millwall would seem a contradiction. It was certainly strongly at odds with widely held popular images of what Millwall fans are all about. The project was funded by HLF, and it looked to gather unique insights into experiences of Black Millwall supporters and also wider football supporter culture, while also challenging perceptions of football supporters more generally. I'd highly recommend it to anyone with an interest in football and cultures. There's a film that the project produced called, I think it's called Black and White Millwall. And it's really kind of fascinating exploration of complexities of club identity and the different attachments that different people have with a club. Also, the oral histories that were created by the project held at the local studies library, so there's a kind of longer term legacy of the project. Lastly, just at the kind of bottom bullet point on this long slide, there's a real urgency for the project that we've identified, and that is kind of widely apparent, and again is represented in a lot of the issues that David raised. So the relationships that different communities have with sport aren't static. The trends of participation change all the time, as well as the values and meanings that are attached to sport. So, for example, if we take cricket again as an example, despite a long-standing connection with the game, the popularity of cricket is in steep decline among Britons of African Caribbean heritage. It's widely noted in kind of academia and in other kind of areas of discussion on cricket. And the reasons for this are complex and quite multifaceted, but the substantial shift has led to a steep decline in numbers of, so for example, Caribbean cricket clubs, and thereby limiting opportunities to capture and preserve the heritage of Britain's once thriving Caribbean cricket communities, as well as the kind of changing dynamics of sport. There's also just the fact that many people who have those memories are dying off, or have there's limited access to kind of capture those perspectives and memories. So, for example, within the Parks to Pavilions project that I mentioned before, have been pointed out to me that of the first generation founders of the Kaide Azam Cricket League that they interviewed in that project, some have since passed away. And if it hadn't been for that project, their memories and experiences would have been lost. So we feel that if concerted action isn't taken to begin addressing unequal representation in sport, then we're very much at risk of losing a hugely significant period of British sporting history, a period where migrant communities have used sport to assert and establish cultural identities, and also in the process reshaped the landscape of sport in Britain. So this is, we're going to stop talking for a bit now. This is the first, we mentioned trying to give space for discussion. So I'm going to, sorry, I'm going to just quickly stop showing this. Fran, are you able to do the magic with the group? Explain what's going on.
I can definitely do the magic from my end, Kris. That's absolutely fine. So what Kris is trying to say is we're going to pop everybody into breakout rooms. So, Kris, what would you like people to discuss while they are in their breakout room?
Quickly
send them off. Share
this again so that people can, if everyone wants to kind of make a note, or at least a mental note. What we're looking at, as we've addressed in the kind of introduction to the webinar today, there is increasing attention across the heritage sector to begin to being paid to the underrepresentation of minority communities, and also looking at issues, how to best represent issues such as migration, cohesion, colonialism. But sport continues to be overlooked in these areas despite its huge potential to speak to these issues. And what I'd like people to have a think about and share ideas on is how should we advocate for the potential of sporting heritage, so whether it's through signposting other work that has kind of significant social reflection that sporting heritage has done, or whether it's highlighting that kind of knowledge and understanding. So yeah, interpret that how you wish, but if everyone is willing to kind of share their thoughts on that issue.
Great, yes, if you want to stop the share. So I'm going to pop everybody into breakout rooms. I'm sure most of you are familiar with breakout rooms by now, after our whole year of Zooming. But if you're not, you will get an invite that pops up on your screen. If you click on the invite, it will whisk you away into a room with 5 or 6 other people. I've précéded Kris's quote, so I will broadcast it to the breakout room, so you've got an aid memoir while you're speaking. You'll have just under 10 minutes or so to have a chat and to share ideas, and then we'll bring everybody back into the main space. And if you can choose a willing volunteer to feed back on behalf of your group, we'll do a quick 2-minute feedback from each group. I think we've got 5 groups in total. Now, that was quite a short amount of time to discuss quite a meaty question. So I'm going to facilitate a little bit of feedback. So without picking on anybody in particular, we'll just work around group by group, and if a nominated person can just feedback just for a couple of minutes, so that then we can move on to the last part of the presentation. So in room 1, so this was the room that had Becky, Christian, Sam, Shane and Tillian. Who would like to feedback on behalf of your group, please?
That would be me.
Thanks, Shane.
No worries. So we started off by talking about Chris's thing at the beginning of the webinar, where it was around the reactive collecting and how that focus on community-led collecting is sort of missing, and that project's base, and how collecting generally in a lot of the sporting heritage museums that we were involved in, it's either it's project funded primarily, it's not necessarily embedded, and it's not cyclical. And we were thinking about how we can reach out to those grassroots levels to address that inequality within the collections. Becky, who is an archivist in our group, she was saying that there are archive outposts that previously, before the funding cuts, were there to reach out into the communities to help with that side of collecting. And there wasn't really anything like that for the museums, we didn't think. And certainly there isn't necessarily the top level national governing body buy-in, where they're all focused on performance objectives and not necessarily looking at the history and what's come before in addressing those sort of inequalities. And then we spoke a bit at the end, just before coming back in, about the toolkits project that Sporting Heritage are doing, which would seem to have quite a lot of obvious overlap with addressing EDI issues and reaching out into those grassroots and trying to get that top level down buy-in to a really accessible way to identify and then start preserving and collecting to address the collections inequalities.
Lovely. You read my mind. While you were all in your breakout rooms, Kris and I were just talking about the toolkit and how this strand of work can be represented in that. So yes, you're right, it will definitely feature in there. Thank you very much. So room 2, this had David Cleave, David Smith, Carl, Richard and Sarah in. So who would like to feedback on behalf of your group?
Hi, that's me. So we had we all sort of like came together and spoke about our own experiences or what we were all looking at, and that was really interesting. So some things that we talked about were growing collections, how we grow the collections, and about how important it is about making connections, about having confidence to sort of tackle these areas and sort of want to do something with it, and very much about communities and partnership working, whether you're talking about local or national collections. It's a really good point about academic research and about how that can really help grow what we're doing, about a platform for all of this knowledge and sharing this information and getting those stories out there, about the role of the heritage sector and how it intertwines with everything, about local sports groups, which I think is something that's come out a lot in this presentation, and also educational resources, how all of this content can be used and shared. So yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And yeah, just picking up on your last point, I know that Derek People, who's writing the education strategy at the moment for Sporting Heritage, is working with Bill and David, who are here today, around creating curriculum resources for the Black football pioneers. So we're hoping that will be leading the way for that sort of resource. So thank you very much. So moving on to group 3. So this had Brian, Henry, Michael, Raf and Tarlokan in. Who's your spokesman?
Yeah, I can do that. Touch messaged me to say if he might have to go early.
Yes, he did say he might have to dissipate.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of introduced ourselves and we discussed the importance of being seen. If people are seen, then it encourages others to be involved, and also the fact that a lot of the curatorial roles, or few of the curatorial roles, are held by members of the Baymore pop community. And I guess that's, Touch mentioned the idea that that's partly down to, wanting to be proactive, so if people from that community want to be proactive with regards to that heritage, then, it's a two-way thing to some extent. But that was, that was the most obvious kind of thing that we discussed. I think Raf mentioned, there's a couple of black female cricketers, and they feel that's important as cricketers, as players, to be seen as kind of role models. And I guess the same needs to apply from a research and curatorial perspective as well, really.
Lovely, thank you very much. So moving on to group 4. So this is the group that had Bill and Karen, Katie and Steve in it. Who would like to feedback on your behalf?
That'll be me, Fran.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, we had representatives of hockey, football and cricket in our group. We struggled to get our minds around the question, I have to say, but what we think the question was about, we would suggest that in terms of advocating to the rest of the heritage sector, Sporting Heritage have some great stories about pioneers and about heroes that could be used as examples to other parts of the heritage sector that they might be able to say. We had in our group Bill, who's written a book about football's black pioneers, and although we weren't familiar with the book, Bill, I'm sure would say that well, he did say that there were lots of great stories in there, and I think heritage audiences want stories, don't they? And I think we've got some great stories that we could tell. One of the other things, because I rather hijacked the conversation based on, I think Kris mentioned the phrase cultural exchange, and I said I think I'm not saying for 1 minute Kris and David were advocating looking at sort of ethnic silos, but I played hockey against that team that was on the first of Kris's photos, Barford Tigers in Birmingham, and I know how important those two white guys in that photo were for setting the culture of the team. And I know that because we played against other completely Asian sides who were, shall I say, not as much a pleasure to play against as Barford Tigers were. The other thing I was very interested in is that there used to be a cricket team in Nottingham called the West Indian Cavaliers. They're now the Cavaliers. And apart from the same guy that runs it 20 years later, who is black, it's a South Asian team. It's morphed from being a black Caribbean origin team to being a South Asian team, and I think this whole sort of interrelationship of different ethnicities. Sorry, that sounds a bit academic, doesn't it? Is actually a really interesting sort of subtext to this whole story.
Lovely,
Okay.
Thanks, Steve. And last but by no means least, the final group, which was Carol, Daniel, John, Nick, Nigel and Sean. Who is going to feedback on your behalf, please? Does anybody give a jump in, or am I going to have to pick somebody? Anybody from that
Hi,
group?
sorry, yeah, we didn't actually get as far as nominating somebody, so I'll step up.
Thanks, John.
I'll stick my video on. Hi, everybody.
Lovely, thanks.
Most of our discussion was around mildly panicking from some of us, because there's a couple of us in the room who are quite new to all this sort of thing. I explained to everybody that I'm part of a project that's working on getting digital technology into care homes, and we're looking at sporting reminiscence, sporting memories as a way in. But one of the issues that we've got with the project overall is, of course, diversity. So we were thinking, how do we not even square the circle? But one of the people came up with the point that it might be easier if we think of ourselves as being facilitators rather than anything else when it comes to trying to generate more of this, if that makes sense. Good, some people are nodding. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's pretty much where we were.
Okay. Is there anything anybody else in that group would like to add to what John has said? Okay, lovely. Well, so that's a wrap up of the breakout rooms. Kris, I hand back to you for the final bit of this session.
Thank you very much, everyone. Those comments were really interesting and useful, and do relate to some of the kind of wider issues that we've been contemplating. So just to, I mean, we saw this like last slide here and the kind of this last topic, and then there's one more other breakout room which I'm hoping will be equally as informative. So what we've been looking at, obviously, as well as the importance of representation in sporting heritage, but what opportunities there are to address the current situation and develop a more representative approach to collecting. So we've identified a few key areas. Obviously, this is, again, it's such a broad topic that there's it's quite a narrow perspective on this, but we've identified some key areas where we feel real change could happen. So primarily, we've come across a number of community-driven sporting heritage projects that have taken place outside of museums and archives that have really explored ethnic diverse histories of sport. I've mentioned a couple already. David mentioned the G&G project. There's the Parts Pavilions project, the Millwall project. All of these happened kind of away from established heritage organisations, and there's a real opportunity there to kind of explore that activity that happens outside of heritage, to look beyond what's happening within our own organisations and to kind of take note of what's happening elsewhere. So on the whole, we identified in the research for this project, we identified 10 different HLF-funded community projects that have taken place in the last 5 years that have a direct relevance to the subject. We've identified projects on cricket, obviously, but as well as Cameroonian football supporters, Punjabi wrestling. There's a range of projects happening out there that can give really valuable perspectives. There's not always an obvious collections development opportunity to these projects. I think it's fair to say you can really look to kind of hijack a project in the name of collections development, but they're a really valuable opportunity to reach out to communities and support work that's going on elsewhere, and also develop knowledge and make links. The key thing that we've kind of working around is that focus on grassroots and amateur clubs as well. So it offers, we'd argue, a much greater opportunity to more accurately reflect participation in sport among different communities than a stronger focus on elite and professional sport. The landscape of grassroots sport and the fact that many clubs and leagues are rooted in ethnic minority communities offers a greater potential to represent and celebrate participation in sport among many more communities. The observation that you made, Steve, about the sorry, I'm just going to flip back, about not siloing sporting activity is really valid, and that's one we've been trying to kind of get our heads around, because what we'd not kind of advocate for is a kind of tokenistic attempt to kind of like target clubs that have a kind of strong link to a certain community, and also because that also obviously overlooks wider participation, it overlooks those changing dynamics in sport and within clubs as well, and it's how do we kind of represent that, as well as just kind of highlighting the fact that there are clubs that have specific links to certain communities, and also it's hard to generalize grassroots sport across all sports. I mean, different sports have different significance, different communities. I mean, the sports that we've been looking at, specifically hockey, cricket, football, there's a kind of trends towards kind of much more diverse landscape at grassroots level. But yeah, as we've seen in football, for example, I mean, the sheer disparity between a number of South Asian players in professional football and the representation at grassroots and amateur level is huge. Grassroots clubs also offer the opportunity to kind of highlight that hugely valuable and central role that clubs have within their communities, and explore the reasons that clubs come into being beyond just the kind of love for the sport. Some clubs have gone to active advocates for inclusion in the wider game, such as Barford Tigers, or the clubs have developed a more kind of broader anti-racist remit. And there's a real kind of opportunity to explore that kind of developing role of clubs. But obviously there are challenges to engaging grassroots clubs. The main challenge, or one of the main challenges, there are many, would likely be the varying degrees of heritage and the preservation of heritage. It's been pointed out to us that many of the more ethnic specific clubs have had the particular disadvantage of not having their own grounds to begin with, their own facilities, and as such, having not had a place to preserve their physical heritage to the same degree that other kind of predominantly white clubs might have had. But despite this, we've found a number of clubs who have online histories, at least, that demonstrate an interest in their heritage and demonstrate the fact that some might hold an archive of some sorts. So, for example, Caribbean Cricket Club was mentioned. They have a really useful history on their club, which features historic photos. Another club called Guru Nanak Football Club in Gravesend, not the same club that David referenced before, have a really detailed history on their website, along with historic team photos. One of the oldest Asian sports clubs in Britain, Indian Gymkhana, have a club history which features quotes and information from original sources taken dating back right to their founding in 1916, I think. I need to double check that. And also, there are clubs who have had a really active approach to their heritage, such as Barford, who with their heritage project in 2015, 2016, and GNG. But so it shows that there is, potential for greater collaboration. As well as grassroots clubs have been exploring how to perhaps better represent wider sporting communities and represent diversity in, for example, supporters groups and that supporter landscape of sport. So yeah, I mean, if we look at football in particular, there are growing numbers of minority ethnic supporters groups, and Kick It Out launched Fans for Diversity recently, which was set up to represent diverse football supporters, to look at the wider sporting community rather than athletes and clubs and players. Some of these diverse supporters groups have a very long heritage. For example, David highlighted Punjabi Wolves, which was founded in 1954. But there is obviously a distinct challenge to capturing and preserving heritage of supporters. There's a lack of institutional heritage. The vast majority of supporters aren't connected to an organised group. But there are many projects that have demonstrated unique models for engaging with supporters and collecting this heritage and encouraging diverse representation. There's a Millwall project that I mentioned before. There's a project that was run by an organisation called Digital Works in London, with Push Up Brentford, which was an oral history project looking to capture perspectives of fans, players and staff on the history of Brentford Football Club. And this project intentionally set out to reflect diversity, so intentionally sought to reflect not purely the perspective that's seen on the terraces, but look beyond, who supports the club more widely. Fans for Diversity themselves created an exhibition in I think just in 2019 or 2020 called My Shirt, My City, which worked with Cardiff City supporters and aimed to normalise the idea of people of colour wearing the Cardiff City shirt, as well as highlighting diversity among the club's fan base and championing the multicultural nature of the city. But ultimately, the lack of physical heritage of supporters might mean that there's more need to embrace that intangible heritage, such as oral histories, and try and embed that into collecting approaches. We've also identified significant potential for collaboration to further projects on, or further activity more generally on diverse representation. So we've spoken to a number of anti-racist and inclusion organisations in sport that work to highlight inequalities in sport, but also promote inclusion of sport among ethnic minority communities. And of the people we've spoken to, the general response has been that improved representation of ethnic diversity and heritage was very much aligned with their own aims, and there were clear acknowledgement of a potential for collaboration. And these organisations could offer, for example, significant knowledge and understanding of diverse participation in sport, or links with communities, or help to raise public profile for activity. There's also academia, where there's a growing number of academics who now specialise in topics relating to race and racism in sport, or sporting experiences of ethnic minority communities. And this is creating a much broader pool of expert knowledge, which offers obvious opportunity to develop collaborative approaches to collecting sporting heritage that can draw upon this expertise. And it's obviously important to note that there are many parallels that we've noted between heritage and academia in terms of the lack of wider recognition of the social relevance of sport, and there's a mutual benefit to be had to raising the profile of sport as a topic for serious consideration of these issues. And again, academia and academics, there's a very comprehensive knowledge that can be shared. There's links with communities. There's a reference point for advocating for social history, the social historical value of sport, and the opportunity to develop projects with aligned aims. So that's where we are. I'm just going to, there's one last group. I'm not sure, have we got time for this, Fran, or should we can incorporate this into just general comments, if that's easier, rather than doing the whole breakout thing. Because
should we have a more general discussion? I think otherwise, I think we're going to run out of time slightly. So if we open it out to the floor, do you want to put that comment? Do you want to put that into the chat thread, and then people will be able to view it alongside their main screen?
I will, if I can type quickly enough.
So it's essentially what resources and support going forwards, isn't it? So
if anyone has any more general comments, questions, observations, then they would be equally welcome regarding the wider issues.
So I know that we've got quite a range of experience in the room. So I know this is not an easy question for people to answer from all levels. But going forward, bearing in mind that we are developing this toolkit, which initially is aimed at the national governing bodies of sport to encourage them to preserve, collect and share their stories. But thinking about your settings, what support and resources would be beneficial for Sporting Heritage to develop to support your work? Is there anything that springs to mind? I know that Kris mentioned quite a lot of projects that they've included, or that they've come out of their research. So would case studies and things like that be useful for people to look at and read?
Yeah, I was going to say case studies from our perspective. I think I think best practice, I suppose, would be really useful to hearing from cultural organisations and sport and heritage organisations that have worked with grassroots previously, and how that's worked, and when it has and when it hasn't worked, I suppose. Ours often is tied to funding and funded projects, so it's not necessarily something we do as second nature. So getting feedback from the organisations on how they've done it would be great.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, so maybe looking at some groups who've got it really pinned into their sort of what they would call their business as usual. Because I think Shane picked up on that idea that so much work is project funded now. Carl, did I cut you off? Were you going to say something?
No, it's fine. I just put my hand up to be next in line.
Jump in.
It's just more a point and just kind of something to consider as well. I mean, there's been mention of a lot of really interesting projects, kind of community-based projects and grassroots projects. And just with my archivist's hat on, I'm just wondering about what thought has been given to the kind of long-term preservation of of the content of those projects, and to ensure that access to the output of those projects continues to be available and potentially more widely shared. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's something we've been kind of actively exploring as well, and it feels like Sporting Heritage, the organisation, is in perhaps a good position as any to kind of at least signpost those projects and try and kind of like preserve the legacy in some form. So, for example, a lot of the projects did create particular archives or kind of collections of oral histories that were then are either community held or have been deposited in kind of local archives. And one area that I've been considering is whether these could be monitored and kind of added to the map of collections that Sporting Heritage holds, and to try and kind of offer again like a more diversity of perspective on sporting collections. And other ways we've been talking about maybe kind of like highlighting the work that these projects have done through more general channels such as kind of social media or podcasts, and try and kind of at least kind of capture a perspective on those projects. So yeah, that's a really useful point. Thanks, Carl.
I know from Sporting Heritage's sort of point of view overall, we were always happy to broker between collections wherever they sit, whether they've come out of projects, and then somewhere that would act as a repository so that that information is remains publicly accessible. But and I know that we as an organisation, we need to raise our profile amongst groups who might not be aware of us, and quite often that is going to be the grassroots groups and community groups who aren't necessarily, if you're outside of the heritage sector, Sporting Heritage might not even be on your radar. So we know that we've got work to do from our side, but we're always happy to broker that. But it's then the mapping and making sure that everybody knows that those projects exist. Any other comments? Henry?
Yeah, I was just, it's a slightly, in some respects, it's a slight tangent, but equally, the outdoor world. The British Mountaineering Council is funded by our support from Sport England, so there's outdoor sport, and I don't think there's a great deal about the sort of ethnic diversity within the Mountain Heritage Trust. I'm not personally involved, but I don't think there's a great deal of interest in that. I have a friend, Mohammed, who will be catching up on this on YouTube. He's the diversity officer for Cumbria Fire Brigade. He'll be catching up on he's does a lot with the BAME community within regards to the outdoor sports, and was a Churchill Fellow looking at how BAME communities in the States have engaged with the national parks. But I was just going to say that in the sort of mountaineering history and outdoor history, there's a lot. It's a sport, or alpinism and mountaineering is a sport that's taken place, or some of the large activity has taken place abroad. If you think of the Himalayas and the Karakoram and so on, and there's been very little study done about the BAME community and the local indigenous population's contribution to that sporting success. And I know that Jonathan Westaway at UCLan in Preston is putting a big AHRC application in for funding for research around the Everest centenary in 1924, which was when Mallory and Irving died. That's why it's such a famous expedition. And he's doing a lot of research on that expedition. And part of that research funding from the AHRC is to look at the contributions made by the Nepali porters and so on and so on in the Himalayas with regards to that sporting success, because they had a background role. The local populations had a background role to that sporting success. So it's, mountaineering is seen as a sport, and a lot of the success came about, certainly abroad, with the support of the ethnic, the local populations. And the same with the Alpine Club Archive. The Alpine Club Archive is the same. There's a lot of images and diaries of kind of colonial mountaineers, questing around the Himalaya and the Karakoram and the Alps and so on. But a lot of that success was came about because of the the Nepali populations and so on. And there are some links that UCLan and the University of Brighton have with academics in Nepal that's going to look into that. So it's a slight tangent, but it's also, I think, kind of you know, connected.
That's a really interesting perspective, and yeah, there's I think what's clearer and clearer is that there are the complexity of different sports and those complex and specific heritages that sports have demonstrates the need for kind of reflection and interrogation across the board, and not just kind of looking at issues of kind of diversity and representation more generically.
There's a history of kind of BAME and POC activity within the outdoors in the UK, you know, be it, you know, Asian fell walking groups or Caribbean, you know, and so on and so forth within the within outdoor sport in the UK, you know.
Just on that point, I think sometimes heritage plays catch up, I think, with some commercial outlets when it comes to representation. So looking at outdoors in particular, I think Berghaus, Finisterre, Craghoppers all have done really well, just because I have an interest in outdoors, in having advocates of Black and ethnic minority advocates now, and they put on events and have ambassadors like the hill walking hijab. So there's lots of like huge Instagram profiles now for representation within the outdoors, and equally in football. Just this past week, EA Sports have had a lot of positive press off the back of their campaign around football and Ramadan, and using Hamza Chowdhury, who's the sort of most prominent South Asian footballer in elite men's football. So yeah, huge organizations from a commercial perspective, these steps have already been made, and it's perhaps our role working in sport and heritage to sort of catch up and make sure that that we're keeping up with that in terms of representation.
Great, thank you. Well, we're just slightly over. So if there are any final comments before I hand back to Kris to sort of close the session. No, Kris, do you want to do your final?
Yeah, I would just say thank you so much for everyone for coming today and for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and perspectives as well. The whole project has been built on that. Well, hope as much as we've enabled it to been built on discussion and collaboration rather than kind of just simply research. So we're really appreciative of everyone's perspectives. If anyone does have any follow-up points, I'm just going to post my email as ever in the chat. If anyone wants to get in, also share any other insights or opinions, or if anyone has any questions, then do get in touch. We're really keen to kind of keep momentum going, or the little bit of momentum that we've started to generate going. So yeah, just say thanks again, and thank you for your contributions.
Lovely. Yeah. So just echoing what Kris is saying. So thank you everybody for your time today. As always, I will send around an email with some wrap-up resources, which will have the link to the recording for this session, David and Kris's slide deck as well, and I will copy out all the links that have gone into the chat. So that will come out hopefully in the next sort of 7 to 10 days. So as you can see, it's a massive topic and something that I think is going to run and run for sporting heritage. Although Kris's work is coming to an end, I know that Justine is looking to continue this thread through further funding. So hopefully watch this space. So just remains for me to say thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye.